In present-day Europe, one of the more disturbing trends among ethnomasochistic migrants is the tendency to convince themselves that they built the continent.
In Europe, black people, society has a historical sensibility that associates with the African contribution to Europe. So, Europe wouldn't have written language and bathhouses and roads or this idea of schools and university. That's African stuff. And Rome, Spain, and Greece, those places are African civilized places.
No. In Europe today, there are two human conceptions which stand confronting each other. One is official and advocated by the authorities. The other realistic and understood privately and intuitively by the people. This is the conception that European civilization was built by people of colour. These so-called contributions increase in extravagance from month to month, each claim being more brazen than the last. What began as a little post-Blitz DIY has apparently evolved into penning some of our greatest literary works. As amusing as all this began, we now find ourselves jockeying for position in a competitive struggle for predominance. And the battle for representation is starting to resemble something like a national conquest. Strangely, the more wild and exaggerated these claims become, the more difficult it can feel to protest them. Notorious Professor of Black Studies Kehinde Andrews, for instance, claims that Britain was built on the back of black labour. Nesrine Malik of The Guardian is of the opinion that black and brown immigrants both built and rebuilt Britain. It's often been said that the tendency to fantasize is a chief characteristic of narcissists. And Douglas Murray, for all his errors, makes a salient point when he asks what happens when a sadist meets a masochist. The gentle and affable conduct of Europeans is in part to blame for this fallacy, struck by a toxic combination of guilt and pity that has nourished these falsehoods, so that over time and with repeated usage they have congealed into fictions resembling truths. And now we find ourselves in a bit of a sticky wicket, because these falsehoods have been swallowed and seized upon jealously, so that European history now looks to be establishing its own form of Year Zero. The conception of a Year Zero, instituted by the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, is the idea that all cultures and traditions within a society must be completely destroyed or discarded, and a new revolutionary culture must replace it, starting from scratch. All of the history of a nation or people before Year Zero is largely deemed irrelevant because it will ideally be purged or replaced from the ground up. What we must understand is that this all boils down to retrospectively accounting for the mass African settlement on our soil. The vast scale of movement into the continent over the past 2 decades continues to be an unacceptable disgrace, unless, by chance, it is discovered that Africans have in fact always been here, in the Overlook Hotel. And this was the point I was very clumsily trying to communicate in last year's Millennial, when I made reference to The Shining's bathroom scene.
Mr. Grady, you were the caretaker here.
I'm sorry to differ with you, sir. But you are the caretaker. You've always been the caretaker. I should know, sir. I've always been here.
I've always been here. An exchange of this very nature occurred only this week in The Guardian when they asked, why are period dramas so white? What supposedly began as the pursuit of a more inclusive casting has, over time, developed into calls for a, quote, more accurate reflection of history, one where black people invented roads, numbers, and bathhouses.
But there is a problem with this vision of British history. It's often almost entirely white. Some of them have the occasional token appearance of a black or brown character, but others don't even bother with that.
Oh dear.
I mean, I thought that there was a long history of diversity in the UK, even before the Windrush era. But if that's true, then why are period dramas so white?
If it appears that the non-white role in period trauma is underestimated, that is because there is no significant body of ignored non-European accomplishment out there for comparison. This meta-peculiarity of stealing our stuff is starting to resemble a Soviet-style neurosis. Solzhenitsyn once said that the worst part of the Gulag system was that it robbed death of its meaning as the end of a fulfilled life. By making death itself anonymous, making it impossible to find out whether a prisoner is dead or alive. In a sense, they took away the individual's own death, proving that henceforth nothing belonged to him, and he belonged to no one. His death merely set a seal on the fact that he had never really existed. In a sense, the bid for more inclusivity almost always requires exclusion. It's like blotting out ink on a manuscript where you can still see the pencil marks. Sticking a bunch of black people in Oliver Twist is a serious annulment that may as well be called abolition. And this is why I tend to call it a replacement. It's not an outright removal of white people, but it is a gradual and successive cancellation of the hitherto orthodox social order. And that means something. This is precisely the kind of pernicious logic you'll find with the likes of Mike Graham when they ask, what do you mean by English? Norman English? Roman English? And it's in this process that a kind of silent death occurs. We might think of it in colloquial terms as a kind of civilizational ghosting.
But it still raises an important question. How truthful are period dramas really when it comes to racial diversity?
In Czech author Milan Kundera's novel, The Book of Laughter and Forgetting, he describes the bargain that negationist historians and totalitarian charlatans impose upon their subjects. Quote, "They were ready to sell people a future in exchange for their past. They wanted to compel him to cast his life away and become a shadow, a man without a past, an actor without a role, and to turn even his cast-away life, even the role the actor had abandoned, into a shadow. Having turned him into a shadow, they would let him live." End quote. And this really extends from what I've said in my former video on humiliation. Even in its darkest period, the Western world has hitherto granted the slain enemy the right to be remembered as a self-evident acknowledgement of the fact that we are all men, and only men. In The Origin of Totalitarianism, it is written that the murderer at least leaves behind him a corpse, and although he tries to efface the traces of his own identity, he has no power to erase the identity of his victim from the memory of the surviving world. Mission diversification, on the contrary, sees to it that the victims of this erasure never existed at all. Diversity has always been here. We simply didn't know it. Nikolai Kovac started looking for his parents in 1953. The year Stalin died and Nikolai turned 17, he had grown up in an orphanage outside Leningrad. When it was time for him to get his identity papers, the orphanage director instructed him to pick a patronymic, a derivative of the father's name that forms part of one's official identity. "You come from nowhere," the orphanage director said. "You have no parents." Kovac's objection was factual rather than existential. He could accept that there were people who came from nowhere, but he knew that he was not one of those people. He had an unusual last name, and this meant that someone somewhere had to know something about him. He told the orphanage director to put down Ivanovich, the Russian equivalent of John Doe. But once he became a trade school student in Leningrad, he began filing information requests with the City Office of Internal Affairs. "No information available," was the response he got. He continued filing his request every few years, for a total of 5 rejections. This account is a valuable reminder of Shakespeare's eternal question: what's in a name? Does English correlate with identity, or doesn't it? The blackwashing of European history, apart from being embarrassing and ridiculous, is all part of ameliorating the crippling insecurities of non-Europeans. The truth is that they borrow stories from us because their own history fails them, arriving in the millions from their battered, impoverished countries, feeling themselves, as soon as they set foot on our soil, the intellectual and demographic enemies of Europe, armed with a resentful inferiority complex. An inferiority complex toward the white civilization, one which, in the case of many West Indians, has evolved into resentment-driven hostility that gets cheekier by the day.
They made civilized by the Moors, who came in 711 in Spain and stayed there hundreds of years, and they ended up with, prior to that though, not having numbers, a sense of what a number was, or written language. So I'm saying all that to say that in European history, they have that.
The intensity of this self-deception would not be half so alarming were it not constantly endowed with flattery and validation. As in any essentially totalitarian propaganda, the aim is to create a scrupulously inverse depiction of reality. Whilst our Lügenpresse deride the hate crimes committed by English natives toward Africans and visible Muslims, which are a rare occurrence and more often than not the result of self-defense, the gratuitous murders of whites are never put down to anti-European sentiment. The purpose of an all-brown casting, such as the recent David Copperfield by Charles Dickens, I'm convinced is all about daring the little Englander to vocalise his displeasure. That way they can persuade the viewers that the guilty ones are none other than the anti-immigrant white folk, even if in actual fact they are the ones being victimised by immigrant violence on a daily basis. Through both its fictions and its news bulletins, television sets out to establish and construct a virtual reality, one that is seen as correct and faithful to hegemonic ideology, and that strives to cast the real world into oblivion, condemning any popular revolt against the daily humiliation of anti-white erasure. All these talentless propaganda productions, whose goal is to generate bewilderment in the minds of the working class, and delight in the shallow idiocy of the middle class, are naturally the work of producers, screenwriters and actors who make a fortune off them, living in fashionable neighbourhoods and never having to cross paths with ethnic gangs or to set foot in a vibrant district. Of course, the unintended, or perhaps intended consequence of this cathodic, self-righteous propaganda is that it stimulates and strengthens resentment among viewers of immigrant origin. This impotent jealousy has turned over time into active hatred. Unknowingly, or perhaps not, the intellectual media class is actually strengthening ethnic division through its so-called integrationist propaganda, by taking white people for fools and force-feeding them guilt-ridden canards. Of course, these painful contradictions can be attributed to an inferiority complex. Both the public and private life of many newly arrived migrants is so manifestly devoid of all signs of a productive and characteristic culture. They speak of their longing for empowerment, whilst at the same time victimising themselves, appealing to the public's pity. They claim to refuse infantilization, but infantilize themselves and community. They reject humiliation and handouts, yet their discourse generates it. This hardly fits with the academic tendency to stress the series of catastrophes, cruelties, and ostracism that have punctuated black and brown history on the continent. On the one hand, we are meant to believe in black innovation and entrepreneurship, while simultaneously believing in their persecution and subjugation. It cannot be both that blacks are a central cog in the European machine, as well as an outsider demonised on the periphery, since you hardly otherize that which is already a part of you. Diversification policy itself is testament to a pre-established mono-ethnic order. Again, you do not diversify that which was diverse from its inception. I'll finish here with a passage from Nietzsche. The cultural Philistine fancies himself a son of the Muses and a man of culture. This incomprehensible error clearly shows that he does not even know the difference between a Philistine and his opposite. Owing to this lack of self-knowledge, he is convinced that his culture is the consummate manifestation of real culture, and since he everywhere meets with scholars of his own type, since all public institutions, whether schools, universities or academies, are so organised as to be in complete harmony with his education and needs, wherever he goes, he bears with him the triumphant feeling that he is the worthy champion of prevailing culture, and he frames his pretensions and claims accordingly. The confusion underlying the cultural Philistine's error may arise from the fact that, since he comes into contact everywhere with creatures cast in the same mould as himself, he concludes that this uniformity among all scholars must point to a certain uniformity in public consciousness, hence to culture. All around him he sees only needs and views similar to his own. Wherever he goes he finds himself embraced by a ring of tacit conventions concerning almost everything. This imposing sameness, ever ready to burst forth, persuades him into the belief that here a culture must be established and flourishing. But Philistinism, despite its systematic organisation and power, does not constitute a culture by virtue of its system alone. It does not even constitute an inferior culture, but invariably the reverse, namely, firmly established barbarity.